Hello guys and welcome back to Planet 40k. In this video we're going to be talking about Necron Catan shards. Do we need them? Do we need them? That's the question we're going to ask ourselves today. We're going to go through some topics such as what Catan can actually do on the tabletop, how each Catan performs, what you're actually going to be sacrificing while you're bringing one to your list, how they hold up in matches and missions, and finally, how they interact with our Necron detachments. Then at the end of all that, I'm going to give you my verdict, my opinion on if we actually need Catan in our lists. So make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're liking, all that stuff. Let's get into this video. Okay, the first thing is we're going to be going through these Catans then. So we're going to do this as like a blanket abilities section here. All the Catan have all of what I'm going to say now, just so that we're on the same page. So they've all got toughness 11 with 12 wounds. They've got a 4+ save with a 4+ invulnerable save, the Necrodermis ability to half all damage, and the 5+ feel no pain save. So they're extremely durable characters, very hard to shift on the battlefield, especially when you've got reanimation protocols unlocked for every turn. Now each shard has its own unique role. Nightbringer and Void Dragon are more about the mortal wounds and the high damage from their weaponry. The Deceiver and the Transcendent Catan are more about the mobility and the redeployment. So that's where I think the Catan's split. There's two that are really nasty and two that are more about the mobility side of the game. Now it's important to note here that neither of the Catan can be your Warlord. They can't have enhancements, they can't be led. They're not a vehicle, they're not Canoptic, Cryptek, Destroyers, Tribe or Noble, so they're not going to really interact with our detachment rules. There are a couple of rules that will interact, but it is very limited synergy, but some buffs can apply, as well as some character buffs, I suppose. So they're a self-contained threat, hard to remove, consistent, and they definitely draw attention. Now this is the unit breakdown. I'm going to go through each one, give a little bit of a brief description about what each one can actually do. So we've got the Nightbringer. This is our close combat assassin, very flexible in engagement range especially, because you've got the strike and the sweep profile, deadly versus monsters, vehicles, as well as 2 wound infantry. Because of that sweep profile, you're likely going to be hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s, and doing a lot of damage, which basically removes models every single time one gets through the armor save. The drain life ability is also important because of the mortal wounds after combat, and even at range with the Gaze of Death, 18 inches, D3 attacks. What I like here is the D6 plus 3 damage that can really take your opponent by surprise, especially when you roll nice on that D6. Now the Deceiver is the cheapest of the Catan, focused on positioning as well as precision. Now you've got that redeploy before the game actually starts, where you can move 3 units and change their deployment and even put them in strategic reserves, and it kind of bends the strategic reserve rules. You can only in theory put 25% in strategic reserves. This doesn't actually apply to those rules, so you can kind of do that after your 25% and still use this ability to move units into reserves if you wish. It's got a precision range attack, so you can use it a bit like Death Marks to pick off characters at range. It's reliable in melee with damage 3 golden fists. It's got stealth, which the other Catans do not have, and OC6, which is also something the Catans don't normally have. They're normally OC4, so OC6 again can catch your opponent off guard when you're trying to nail down an objective. Very strong, holding the ground. Now the Void Dragon excels against vehicles. Not only is it absorbing wounds from enemy vehicles, but it's effective with its Spear, the Void Dragon in particular, with anti-vehicle 2+ on both the melee and the ranged weapons. It's also effective against infantry. There's a lot of damage 1, damage 2 attacks going off here. It's got a solid durability like the other ones and a long-term threat. But why I've mentioned the durability in particular here, because of the fact that it can absorb wounds. The Nightbringer can't absorb wounds, the Deceiver can't absorb wounds, but the Void Dragon can, and this adds on with the reanimation protocols. And then finally the Transcendent Catan. This is like the balanced all-round Catan shard. It's strong at range and in melee. It can teleport when advancing, which gives you a little bit of ball control. Maybe if you pull the card engage on all fronts, this Transcendent can actually help if you've not got the units that can get to a certain quarter of the battlefield. Its range attack also has assault, so you can actually shoot it after doing your teleport move. You won't be able to charge though because you have advanced. And it's got deep strike, which is very cool. It's the only shard with that flexible deployment, which is also very handy in the Hypercrypt Legion if you hyperphase it, because if you hyperphase out, deep strike back in, yes, it is a 9-inch charge, but you do get to charge, whereas if you're doing the teleport move, you don't. So that is the 4 Catans and a little breakdown of what they're about. Next, we're going to go on to what I've called the sacrifice. What are you actually sacrificing in order to get a Catan shard in your list? Whether it's 1,000 points, 2,000 points, what are you sacrificing? Now, because they're a high points investment, it gives you less room for the other important units. This is what you could be potentially giving up. You could be potentially giving up some Canoptic Wraiths with the Technomancer, which is a lot of board control in the no man's land, because they're very difficult to kill. They can do the same sort of thing as the Catan, I suppose, but you've got a lot more wounds, a lot more attacks, a lot more staying power potentially, depending on your matchup. You could go with 20 warriors with a Royal Warden and Orokin the Diviner. That's 20 bodies with OC2 per model that can fall back and shoot, and a 4+ invulnerable save. Again, depending on your matchup, that could be very challenging for your opponent, or it just takes place of the additional anti-tank piece that you may have wanted. Maybe you wanted a Doomsday Arc and a couple of Locust Heavy Destroyers in a unit. That's going to take away a lot of firepower by going with those Catans rather than those additional anti-tank pieces. Now, you're not just sacrificing units when you go with a Catan, you're also sacrificing synergy within your list. I've literally got every single detachment here and what you're losing if you were to take a Catan. So if you were within the Star Shatter arsenal, they don't have assault because they're not vehicles and they're not mounted. So you're losing that. If you were to take Locust Destroyers instead, they would have assault and obviously access to stratagems and stuff. If you're playing the Obeisance Phalanx, they're not going to get the +1 to wound. They're not Triarch, they're not Noble, they're not Lichguard, they are just Catan monsters at the end of the day. So you're losing that +1 to wound, which you could have been getting from 10 Lichguard with the Swords and Shields. You're not going to get the command protocols in the Awakened Dynasty, because they can't be led. Yes, they do actually hit on 2s, but if there's any negative modifiers, that will affect their hit roll, and they can't be led, so therefore they're going to gain no buffs from the command protocols, as well as the protocol of Eternal Revenant. You can't be bringing them back because they're not infantry. In the Canoptic Court, there's no rerolls, they're not Canoptic units, of course, or any of the stratagems because they're not Cryptic or Canoptic. In the Annihilation Legion, pretty much the same applies here. They've not got the Destroyer keyword, they're not flayed ones, there's no rerollable charge here, there's no stratagem use here whatsoever for the Catan shard. And finally, the Hypercrypt Legion. Yes, they do get to use the Hyperphase ability, but they can't use Cosmic Precision, which I think is a big deal. They are monsters, and monsters are not allowed to use Cosmic Precision, so there's no 6-inch Deep Strike. They do have to come on from a table edge, which is sometimes quite annoying. There's not always room, or maybe all the action is in the centre of the battlefield. They're not going to get there. They're losing that part, as well as the monolith, in fact. They can't be using anything to do with the monolith whatsoever, which that detachment is kind of built around. There's other things that you will sacrifice as well. For example, they can hold the No Man's Land's objectives, but they're only OC4, apart from the Deceiver, of course, which is OC6. So they can very easily be outscored by literally 3 Orc Boys. 3 Orc Boys will have OC6, and they'd outscore a Void Dragon, which is kind of ludicrous really, but they'd outscore it, they'd hold the objective, and we wouldn't. So they can be outscored by small enemy units. Also, the small base sizes, apart from the Void Dragon, the other 3 have very small base sizes. I know the Nightbringer's coming out at some point next year. He will have a bigger base, but at the moment he's got a small base. The Transcendent has a small base, the Deceiver has a small base. So you can't really screen out the objectives by using your large base as an area coverage like the Void Dragon can. The Void Dragon can literally cover like 1/3 of an entire objective by himself, and if they've got to stay 1 inch away from him, that's even better. You're also sacrificing your movement and your mobility because they're very slow. They're moving 6 inches. With the Silent King, you may be able to use the Aura to get an extra 2 inches. That's if you've got a very specific list, and that's a very expensive list with the Silent King and Catan. But normally these guys are very slow. They're moving 6 inches, and if you want them into a new location once in the middle of the game, you want them to go in a completely different part of the battlefield, but they're not likely going to get there because they're just too slow. Compare them to Canoptic Wraiths that move 10 inches, or Necron Warriors. Necron Warriors are slow, they're actually 5-inch movement. But because of the fact that they've got such a large footprint, a 22-man blob, if you include the 2 characters, potentially you've got Cryptothralls or the new Tomb Crawlers in there, you could have a 24-man unit. And because their footprint is so large, it's quite easy for them to access parts of the battlefield in the middle of the battle. They can also stretch across 2 different objectives as well, which is something else the Catan won't be able to do. They can only control 1 area. Catan are not going to control the entire battlefield, they're just going to control 1 location, a very big presence but very limited reach, and that literally is the trade-off when you're taking a Catan shard. Now what about the matchups and missions and counterplay? Catan shards are best against elite units, vehicles and very big threats. Whether it's Mortarion, Magnus the Red, Scatterbrand, all the big stuff, I think Catan can cope with them. The big vehicles, Land Raiders, easy, not a problem for a Catan. That's their bread and butter, they want to go into stuff like that. They're also forcing your opponent to overcommit resources into a Catan, because if they don't finish a Catan off, we're going to reanimate, we're going to get our wounds back, and it's already hard enough to take wounds off these things, so they're going to overcommit their resources from their 2,000 point list to try and kill a Catan. They're strong in mid-board missions. If the mission is all about getting objectives in the no man's land and taking over, most of them are, to be honest with you, that's quite good for Catan, because they just need to travel into the no man's land. They don't need to go much further than that. They can shoot there, they can fight there, they can shoot within engagement range there. So that is actually a good thing for Catan if the mission is all about the no man's land area. They're also excellent at holding key lanes. If you put them down a lane, they can literally hold that down. Your opponent is very likely to ignore that side, because they can just go to the complete opposite flank, which means that one Catan could literally hold a flank down if they wanted to. And finally, they're just a great deterrent for enemy pushes. I've kind of literally just said that about the flanks. If you put a Catan in a certain location, your opponent is likely not going to want to tangle with a Nightbringer, for example. Now, what are the Catan weak at? Well, we're weak at Horde armies or high OC lists. Tyranids, Orcs, Guards. Now, I know, in fact, an Imperial Guard list with a crap load of Imperial Guard bodies won quite recently in a GT. People might say, well, no one plays Hordes. Well, if you look at the GT, someone literally did win using Hordes, so it is a thing. It's not the most common of lists, but it is there, and maybe it's making a comeback. But against, like I said, Hormagaunts in 20s, Orc Boys in big blobs, even though we can use our sweep profiles with certain Catan, sometimes it's overkill, especially the damage 2 stuff, and we still do have limited attacks at the end of the day. We're not going to sweep 20 to 30 guys off the battlefield in one go. We also can't cover multiple objectives effectively. We can cover one at best. They're not going to cover more than that. We're also weak against weapons that modify damage after a roll. So for example, a melter weapon. Normally against a standard weapon, let's say it was a damage 4 weapon, you're going to half that to damage 2, then take your Feel No Pain saves against that 2 damage, well, the remaining 2 damage. But if it's a Melter 4, for example, you're going to half the original damage. You don't half the plus 4 until after. You don't do that part until afterwards. If it was a 2 damage Melter and then it had a plus 4 on it, you're going to half the 2 damage to a 1, but then you're going to plus the 4 afterwards to make 5. So you've got 5 plus Feel No Pain saves to make. We're weak against those kind of weapons because we literally cannot modify that stat. The plus will always happen. We're weak against lethal hits because we're going straight through our toughness of toughness 11. So they're going to have more wounds in the wound pool. And finally, devastating wounds. I mean, that's quite a weakness to a lot of things. Devastating wounds, we don't get our invulnerable save. We still do get the Feel No Pain save, thankfully, but anything that's got criticals that become mortals or just mortal wound abilities, it is a pain. Even though we are tough as nails, we do only have 12 wounds at the end of the day. As for counterplay tips, now smart players will ignore or avoid the shards completely. If you put a Void Dragon on the left flank, they're likely not going to go down our left flank. They're not going to want to tangle with it because they know they're not going to win that fight. Because we've got the limited mobility of 6 inches, it makes move blocking for your opponent very effective. You can literally screen out certain areas or certain places. So positioning early is actually a really critical thing with Catan, which is what I'm finding quite a lot. Weaving them in and out of terrain is also helpful because they're not titanic. And just getting them into the right location, the key locations of the mission in particular, the mission is where it's at, because your opponent has to also play the mission. If the mission revolves around the center objective, then that's where the Catan need to go. Because really, we need to destroy approximately 300 points, give or take. Some of them, the Deceiver's a bit cheaper than 300 points, but they're approximately 300 points. Just to earn their keep, that's what they need to remove from the battlefield. Now, what about the detachment impact? If you're taking a Catan, what does that do? We spoke briefly about detachments earlier on, about what you're sacrificing, but what can we do in our detachments when we take a Catan? Now, within the Awakened Dynasty, of course, we said earlier, we can't be leading a Transcendent Catan, so we're missing that +1 to hit bonus, but it's not a major issue since they're already hitting on 2s. It's only the negative modifiers that will affect that. And there are a couple of stratagems that you could use here. You've got the Protocol of Sunstorm to provide assault. Not sure why I've got a Transcendent Catan on the picture because he has assault already, but you could be adding assault to a Nightbringer, for example. He won't be able to charge after shooting, but if he needs to get in a better location and still fire, that could be a thing. Or the Protocol of Conquering Tyrant to reroll 1s at half range. Of course, everything misses on 1s, being able to reroll them is a very handy deal. The Canoptic Core, we're not getting the Power Matrix, of course, no rerolls because we're not Canoptic or Cryptek, but we're still synergizing quite well with the Detachment because of the mid-board play. We want to be taking the No Man's Land, opening the Power Matrix for our other Canoptic units and Cryptek units that we've got within our list. Especially now that we've got those Tomb Crawlers, which can be going alongside the Battle Line units like Immortals and Warriors, which then gives them the Canoptic keyword so they can use stratagems and whatnot. So there's a real good combo with Catan Shards and Canoptic Wraiths because there's just very durable and a lot of pressure when it's coming from Catan, as well as the Wraiths that neither of them die that easily. There is zero interaction with the Detachment stratagems. Again, no Canoptic, no Cryptek, so they're kind of running on their own and doing their own thing. The Hypercrypt Legion, again, we can't use Cosmic Precision because monsters are excluded. We can hyperphase into reserves, but it's a 9-inch charge on a table edge, which is very risky. Rapid Ingress is probably a better option, but you can do that in any detachment, so you don't necessarily need to save it for the Hypercrypt Legion. You can't deploy around the Monolith either because we're not infantry, which is a shame. That would be kind of cool if a Nightbringer popped out of a Monolith. But we can reanimate when we've hyperphased with the Reanimation Crypt stratagem. So if you pull them off the board and they're in strategic reserves, they've normally missed the command phase where they normally reanimate, but there is a stratagem where you can reanimate off the board, as long as your Warlord is on the battlefield. In the Obeisance Phalanx, again, we're not Noble or Triarch or Lich Guard, so there's no worthy foes benefit, no +1 to wound. The bigger stuff like the Nightbringer and Void Dragon may not necessarily need it, but it's still a bit of a nerf if you're going with that detachment with Catan. Now we can flank the Silent King for the rerolls of 1s and any supporting auras like the Movement Aura, for example, but that again is a very expensive unit to take. The Silent King 400 points, then the Catan, which is approximately 300, quite a pricey play. And 2 of our Catans can use the Enslaved Artifice stratagem for 5+ criticals on sustained hits. I believe that is the Transcendent Catan and the Void Dragon because they've got sustained hits, they're ranged and melee attacks. With the Star Shatter Arsenal, we're not getting assault because we're not mounted, we're not vehicles, but we do get to use the +1 to hit on enemies that are on objectives, although it is mostly redundant because we do already hit on 2s. Again, it might be because there's a negative modifier, maybe there's a stealth ability on, but then we've got the +1 to hit if they're on an objective, so it does still work with Catan there. Again, we can make use of the Silent King or the Dread Majesty Aura if you've got a Command Barge or an Overlord with that enhancement, so they could be using the rerolls of 1s to hit and wound potentially. There's also the Merciless Reclamation stratagem to work on any unit for a +1 to wound. That could be really useful on the bigger stuff, even though we've got a high strength. Maybe it's not enough to wound on 2s, but with this stratagem, you can be hitting on 2s and wounding on 2s against the big stuff, which is quite nice. There's the Reactive Reposition stratagem, works on any unit as well. So you can do your reactive D6 move. It is only D6, but potentially it's just assisting your Catan with the mobility because that's what they lack. And the Endless Servitude stratagem works on any unit as well to reanimate after the fight phase, which I think is cool because if it's your opponent's fight phase and you reanimate, then you get into your command phase in the next turn, you reanimate again. If you've got a reanimator nearby, you could be doing 4 times D3 reanimations in the space of 2 phases, which is really cool. And then the Annihilation Legion. Detachment bonuses are only working on Destroy and Flayed 1 units, as we said. We're not going to be getting to use any stratagems, but they can work as an individual pressure piece. But the synergy is very minimal, especially with the units that you're going to take. Flayed ones are not going to interact with a Void Dragon and so on, so they're just working solo, and I probably wouldn't recommend Catan in an Annihilation Legion. So what's my verdict? Do we need Catan? I mean, Necrons already have quite a strong internal balance. We've got units that trade better and synergize more, and we've got pretty efficient detachments. The Star Shatter Arsenal right now is doing pretty well. The Hypercrypt Legion's always done okay. The Awakened Dynasty, one of my personal favourites, I think has a lot of balance to it. So I think we've already got a good bit of balance, and in those individual detachments you've got good options. Like even if you play the Canoptic Core, you're likely going to prefer to take the Wraiths or Doomstalkers over a Catan because of all the rerolls and benefits that you get. Whatever detachment you play, you will find a better trade-off, which has more synergy. In terms of my verdict as far as detachments go, I think, like I said, we've just got units that are better in each detachment, that can do better things than Catan and synergize better than Catan can. However, those lists can become repetitive or predictable, in fact. I find myself, if I'm playing the Canoptic Court, the list is almost the same. I know we've got some more units lately with the Tomb Crawlers and the Macrocytes, so maybe the list will get a little bit slightly different now, but ultimately the lists become quite repetitive, especially if you're playing the meta units or going up against meta army, so you need to bring your A game. The Catan kind of gives a different flavour, but I don't believe we need Catan to win a game. Catan can enhance certain lists when they're used correctly. Great for pressure and punishment playstyles. They're adding a unique twist in a way to force your opponent to adapt. I think that's more for the friendlier games really, because at competitive level your opponent will adapt. It's, you know, that's the standard. But if you're playing the friendlier games, you're adding that twist. It's like a twist card. You're saying, right, today I've got a Catan, deal with it. You know, you've got your game plan, I've got a Catan, let's play. So ultimately, they're not essential. They're not essential. They're definitely fun, and they're definitely a powerful option when used right. Do I use Catan a lot? No, I don't. I honestly don't. It's because of the detachments I play, and I just don't seem to be able to find a gap for them or a need for them. There's just other alternatives in each detachment that I find more useful for those detachments. And if you're using them for like the No Man's Land battle, I normally go with Canoptic Wraiths, and once you've got a couple of Canoptic Wraith bricks, you're definitely not leaving much room for Catan. But that's my personal say. Let me know yours down below. Are you using Catan? What detachment are you using them with? Just so I can see in the comments what you're doing. And yeah, make sure you're sharing and liking and subbing and all that stuff. Right guys, my throat's about done. I'm still recovering, but I hopefully will see you in the next one.